Let's go ahead and get right into what are the actual content categories and what do you need to know and be working on to succeed with these. So the first thing is that the content on the math on both tests is pretty identical to each other. One thing that you're going to see is that a lot of the differences between the two tests since the revision of the SAT about 2-3 years ago is that they become more similar to each other. One of those areas is the math. There used to be a lot more geometry on the older SAT. They've really reduced that in favor of focus on functions. And so I want to go through basically what the main categories are, and then we'll talk a little bit about what each of the tests does differently from the other. So first things first, both tests are going to cover what you've learned in your math class all the way up through basic trigonometry. You could see some introductory trig elements on the SAT. ACT goes a little bit further and starts getting into some rotations involving radians and some basic other trig concepts on the coordinate plane. And so what you see here to start with, though, is you've got odds and evens, remainders, exponent rules, prime numbers, and roots. I want to stop there because these are basic concepts. They are not easy concepts. So I've tutored students who are looking at graduate school. They're taking their GMATs or GREs or DATs or OATs or whatever. Almost exactly the same issues around, for example, exponents. You don't do exponents much. Nobody does these days, except for maybe epidemiologists, but we'll leave that aside. And so what you end up doing with this is forgetting the rules. And so I see the college kids, they come in, they've forgotten the same rules. What happens to a negative number raised to a negative fractional exponent inside parentheses that themselves are raised to a negative fractional exponent? None of these rules are hard on their own, but you put them all together and it becomes pretty complicated pretty quick. So you want to make sure you review some of these fundamentals before you go any further. Again, in particular, the exponent rules. Prime numbers, evens, odds, less important, but it's still good to know what happens when you multiply an odd times an odd, an even times an even times an odd, and generally what those patterns are. After that, you're going to cover the stuff you see in your algebra classes. So you're going to have basic one-variable algebra at the start, and then you have two-variable algebra, which shows up quite a bit. You have the classic, Steve is selling hot dogs and hamburgers. A hot dog costs $2, a hamburger costs $3. He earned $37 and sold, 12 hot dogs and 5 hamburgers. Or, excuse me, I shouldn't say that. He sold some hot dogs and some hamburgers. You probably have to figure out how many hot dogs or hamburgers he sold, but that's the classic two-variable question that's based around the word questions, and then you have the other two-variable type around basically graphing lines on the coordinate plane. A lot of y equals mx plus b stuff. And when I say y equals mx plus b, and if you're not sure what I'm talking about, that's definitely a sign that you want to start reviewing your two-variable algebra, because they do, again, a fair amount of lines, intercepts, where the two lines intercept each other, where they intercept the xy axis. Stuff's pretty common, so you want to start there. After that, you will see quadratics. So that's going to be your good old quadratic formula. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all of that over 2a. That shows up in particular on the SAT. It's fairly uncommon on the ACT. I see it once in a blue moon that they require you to know that, or it's very helpful to know that. You're trying to find the roots of some quadratic. That's a little tricky and you need to know that, but it does definitely show up on the SAT. I haven't seen a test where it's not been used or been very, very useful. Geometry is still on both tests. It's no longer nearly as important. You're not seeing as many problems, but you do see triangle area questions. You see circle area questions. You see a lot of the proportional parts of a circle. So the angle measure of a wedge, or a sector as it's more properly called, of a circle, that's proportionate to the area of that sector out of the whole circle. Those types of geometry concepts still show up pretty frequently. So one thing is that in the in-person lessons, we do have a formula bank, and I believe VSAC is going to make that formula bank available for download if it is not already. That is all the formulas you need for the SAT and pretty much all that you'll need for the ACT. Occasionally I see a strange formula pop in, but do work with the formula bank. So let me explain that, because one mistake mistake that I see very frequently that students make is they'll do practice, you'll go ahead, you'll come across a problem, you'll go, oh, I could do this problem if I could remember the formula. Oh, well, I guess I'll just take a guess at it, get it wrong in practice, and move right on. That's not useful in practice. What you want to do there is you want to have the formula bank in front of you. You see the problem, you go, oh, I could do this if I had the formula. Look at the formula. Make a mark next to it. It's not going to help you with the other things you need to be developing, which are problem breakdown skills, identifying patterns, learning how these things come up again and again, to just go ahead and stop right there and get it wrong because of the formula. Look at the formula, apply the formula, learn how to break the problem down further past that formula stage. And like I said, make a little mark next to that formula every time you need it. And the reason why is because as you get to the week before test day, you can take a look at your own formula bank and see which formulas have a bunch of checks next to them. Those are the formulas you need to be memorizing because those are the formulas that show up frequently on the test and that give you trouble with remembering them. So it's a way to help you self-diagnose a little bit better about where you need in math, what skills you need to develop, while also still helping you build the important other skills than just formula memorization. After that, there's a few pieces of other topics that show up on the test. We've got some statistics concepts, mean, mode, median. One thing I want to update is that I've seen students struggling with standard deviation. That's the last of the fundamental statistical concepts they need for this test. Remember, standard deviation is how far, on average, each piece of data is from the average of all the data. So spread out data has a bigger standard deviation than bunched up data. That's going to have a small standard deviation. You do want to review that because I've seen it's a new concept for these tests. They didn't used to test it until about 2-3 years ago. With the new SAT revision, it's become much more frequent. So make sure you familiarize yourself with standard deviation. You don't have to know the formula. The formula is kind of a little bit of a nightmare, but you do need to know what the concept is because those questions are actually pretty simple to answer once you know it. It's just a matter of knowing the one with the bunched up numbers has smaller deviation, the one with the spread out numbers has greater standard deviation. But if you don't know that fundamental, you're going to get that question wrong, and it's usually easily avoidable. Finally, a little bit more statistics, combinations and permutations. I'm going to take a moment here and talk about a topic I don't like to discuss, and that is calculators. I don't like to discuss calculators because I think students who use the TI-80 series have a distinct advantage. Those calculators are expensive, and I don't think that's fair to students to have a calculator that literally can just kick out permutations and combinations, and other students don't. But my job is to give the best advice that I can, and I do have to point out there that these calculators, the TI-80 series, the TI Inspires, they all have pre-programmed functions to solve combinations and permutations questions. So just so you understand, a combination and a permutation, they're basically figuring out how many sets of subsets you can get out of something. So for example, you can have a combination of there's 10 players on a basketball team, only 5 of them can be on the court at a given time. How many combinations of 5 athletes can you have if those are the rules of basketball? And you'd plug in 10, and then you'd go to your calculator, you'd press the combination button, you'd put in 5 for the subgroup, and it'll spit right out how many combinations there are of those 5 basketball teams. So I'd encourage you to spend a little time just reviewing combinations and permutations. Not a huge topic, but it does show up, and particularly how these calculators can do that. I would also encourage students, a used calculator does addition just as well as a new calculator. There's a lot of these TI-80 series floating around on the internet at much more affordable prices than what you can find new from the store. So if it is going to be a cost burden, do try to find one of the used ones. It's a lot cheaper that way and every bit as good as a new one. One last thing is to make sure that I point out to you that the SAT has a free response section on it, on each of the 2 math sections. So SAT has 2 math sections, one of them with calculator, one of them without calculator. Without calculator is not any more difficult in terms of the underlying math. In some ways, it's actually easier. They don't expect you to do long division problems, Generally, there might be one question like that. The rest are going to have usually pretty simple numbers to work with, so you don't have to do like, 787 divided by 1.86. Nobody's doing that in a reasonable amount of time. They don't have that on the no calc. The calculator section, again, a little bit more tricky in terms of calculations, have to be a little bit more precise, but it's not a night and day. It's like a little bit more difficult. And of course, you have your calculator. On both of those sections, however, the last couple questions are going to be free response. So it's going to be the last 5 questions on the no calc, the last 8 questions on the calculator section. But they're just bubble in. They're not themselves, again, any more difficult. And generally speaking, especially the early free response questions are easy as the easiest multiple choice questions. The only thing I'll say else about the free responses, if you get a negative answer, you've gone off the tracks. All the answers are positive, and I've heard an urban legend. I have no way of verifying this, but I put it out there. If you do have to guess blind, I have heard that the even answers show up twice as frequently as odd answers. So take your best even guess and go from there with the free responses.